Hi, this is National Master Dan Heisman, and we're here with another video to help you improve your chess game. Today we're going to talk about the 6 common chess states. And this was a novice nook that I wrote many years ago that was very popular. I'm going to kind of review it today. In his book, Secrets of Grandmaster Endgames, Grandmaster Andy Soltis suggested that he liked to get a glass of water when he went into the endgame to remind himself that now the principles have changed. The things that made sense in the opening and middle game didn't necessarily apply in the endgame. It was different principles. So I thought about it and I thought, how many different types of states do we have besides the endgame where principles might be different? So when you know a principle like move every piece once before you move any piece twice, you want to know what state it applies for, and obviously that one applies in the opening. So I came up with 6 common chess states. They're not the only states, but they're the 6 most common ones where principles might or might not apply in a different way than they do in the other states. So let's take a look at them. The 6 that I listed are the opening, the endgame, castling on opposite sides with queens still on the board, middle games with a closed and fixed center where all 4 center pawns are locked together, positions where one player is winning easily, and any other positions, including most of the endgames with either an open center or a semi-open center. Once you understand what state you're in, that'll help you figure out which principles might apply, and we're going to go kind of through those fairly quickly right now. All right, so let's take a look at them. The first one I listed was the opening. What is the opening as far as I'm concerned? It's from the start of the game until all your pieces are mobilized for middle game action. So that's the main thing. The 3 goals of the opening are to activate all your pieces efficiently, safely, and effectively. And secondly, to find a good place to tuck your king off into the middle game. And the third is to get some sort of control of the center. Those are the 3 goals of the opening, but there's many principles in how they apply. As we said, move every piece once before you move any piece twice, unless there's a tactic. It's kind of the granddaddy principle, but there's all kinds of other ones, like the fun one, castle early and often, and so on. So what are some of the things that you might consider during the opening? Well, besides trying to achieve your goals, you have other principles that apply, like move your slow pieces before you move your fast pieces. What are slow pieces? Well, pawns, kings, and knights are slow, but the knights are the ones that are the fighting ones. So usually you have that famous principle, knights before bishops, which often means knight, bishop, castle, and then knight, bishop. If you have book moves, of course, you don't have to pay attention to principles. If you know the book moves, then the principles wouldn't apply. But if you're not sure what to do, then knights before bishops, get out your knight and bishop on the side you want a castle, and then bring out the other knight and the other bishop. Okay? One of the ones that I have always told my students about is make the moves that you must play before the moves which leave you choices. It's more flexible to do that. So if you have 2 moves and you know one of them you have to play and the other one you think might be good and you're not sure which one should come first, play the one that you know you have to play and delay the other one so you get more information from your opponent's move as to whether or not that moving that piece there is actually good. Also, you don't want to take inordinate amounts of time to play your opening moves. You want to follow Botvinnik's rule, which is if you're playing a normal kind of opening where you're just kind of developing your pieces as opposed to, let's say, a King's Gambit piece sack opening, then you want to not spend more than about 20% of your time for the first 15 moves. So if you're playing a 60-0 game, hopefully you're not playing long games with no increments, but if you're playing 60-minute with, let's say, a 5-second increment, then 20%, you can kind of ignore the increment if it's really small. 20% of 60 is 12. You want to have about 48 minutes left on after move 15. But if you're playing with a big increment like 45, you can't just take the minutes and do it because the increment time adds up to be quite a bit also. So for instance, in a 45 game, you want to have about 41 minutes left after your 15th move. These are just rough guidelines, of course. All right. Now let's take Andy's state, the endgame. What are you trying to do? Well, what is the endgame? I say the endgame is the part of the game where the king can take an active part. Are there some exceptions where there's some very rare middle games where a king can come marching up the board? Yes, but in general, if there's enough pieces off the board that your king can start to play. And in one of Solis's other books, he mentions if the non-pawns add up to about 13 points in Reinfeld values or less, then you could start to use your king. What's 13 points? Well, that's 2 rooks and a minor piece, 2 rooks and a knight, 2 rooks and a bishop, or maybe a queen and a knight or a queen and a bishop. When there's only that much material left on the board, then it's time to make sure to start getting your king into the action. So that's Andy's rule. Anyway, what are some of the other endgame principles that might apply in this state? Trying to do things really quickly is often wrong. Sometimes it takes a while to get maneuvers going, and you don't want to be impatient. Sometimes you can even repeat the position just to gain some time on the clock if you have a big increment. In fact, you might even lose a tempo on purpose just to get into like a good Zugzwang position. The king has to go out and fight. We already said that. King safety is important, but the king is important to get out there and fight. The king's fighting value in the endgame, if you've never heard this, it's very important, is about 4 1/4, meaning if you leave your king in the corner, and let's say you're up a knight and you're trying to win the game and you leave your king in the corner, and let's say you have a bishop and knight and 4 pawns and you're fighting against a bishop and 4 pawns, but your opponent is defending with his king and your king is not trying to help, then it may be impossible for you to win because you're fighting with like 3.5 points of value with your extra knight, but your opponent has 4 1/4 points of extra value with his king. So until you bring your king up, it may be impossible to win. I see a lot of beginners make that mistake. They keep their king tucked away like it's the middle game, and they wonder why they can't make progress in the end game because the opponent's king is actively defending and their king isn't actively trying to help. Okay, the concept of space, which is so important in the opening and especially in the middle game, starts to become useless. Space is basically the distance between your pawns where they started and where they are now. And as you have a lot of space, it gives your pieces more activity and mobility if your space is used wisely. But in the end game, a lot of times the pawns are traded off enough that really what the pawns are trying to do is promote, and the pieces have a lot of room for maneuverability anyway, so getting extra space isn't so much a big advantage, except for those positions, as I said, where promotion becomes an issue. Pawn structure, okay? Some things that are not so bad in the opening or middle game, like let's say a weak pawn in the end game might be a decisive factor. So if you have the worst pawn structure, then you usually want to keep the position dynamic and try to play with a lot of activity in the pieces and not make a lot of trades, because once you trade, then the static weaknesses become bigger. Centralization. Well, centralizing your queen is very important sometimes centralizing the king. I hear people say, what do you do with the king in the end game? You bring it to the middle. I don't think of it that way. I think if you bring your king into the action, wherever the action is, if all the pieces are on the king side, then bringing your king into the middle doesn't make sense. You want your king on the king side where all the pawns are. But if the action is all over the board, then sure, maybe the king in the middle might be the right way. Okay? Faster pieces gain more power as the board is cleared. So for instance, according to Grandmaster Larry Kaufman, knights are only worth about a pawn less than rooks in the initial position of the game, maybe a little bit more than a pawn less. But in the end game, they're worth about 3 pawns less. In the Reinfeld values, knights are worth 3, rooks are worth 5. The difference is 2. But actually, if there's lots and lots of pawns on the board, the difference is much less. And if there's almost no pawns on the board, then the difference is much more. So those are good things to know. All right, you want to make sure if you're the person who's trying to win that you have enough mating material. For instance, you may have a final pawn, which you need, because even if you're up a knight or a bishop, you can't mate with a king and a knight or a king and a bishop. You have to mate with at least a knight and a bishop or a rook or promote a pawn. So pawns become very, very important. The next position we're going to look at is castling opposite sides with queens. All right, why do I say with queens on the board? Well, we have that typical saying that if you castle opposite sides, you throw the kitchen sink at your opponent. But if there's not enough material on the board for mating attacks, let's say both sides only have a rook, a bishop, and a knight, and you're castled opposite sides, you're probably not going to have a mating attack. So as a good general principle, if the queens are still on the board and you're castled opposite sides, then throwing the kitchen sink at your opponent's king, and whoever gets there first will probably win, makes a lot of sense. And especially these attacks on the flanks when you're castled opposite sides are more effective when the center is fairly, not necessarily fixed or locked with pawns, but at least very stable, so you can't get these counterattacks in the middle, because if you start attacking on the side and the middle blasts open, very often, if your opponent can control the middle of the board, then your attack on the side doesn't work very well. So you want the center to be at least stable, doesn't have to be fixed. All right, when you're castled on opposite sides, also material is less important. What do I mean by that? Well, for instance, suppose you lose a pawn on the side of the board where your opponent's king is and your king is not. Then you could actually benefit from that, from having open lines for your rooks and your queens to attack the enemy king. If you really blunder early in the game and you lose material and your opponent castles first, it's a good idea to try to castle on the opposite side. It makes the game a lot more dynamic, and therefore you have a good chance to get an attack even though you're down in material by throwing the kitchen sink at your opponent's king where the material is not quite as important. So when you're already winning the game, let's say early in the game you have the better pawn structure, you win the bishop pair, you win a pawn, whatever it is that makes you better, and your opponent castles, a lot of times, if you can, castle on the same side so they don't have that chance to throw the kitchen sink at you. When you castle on the same side, when you're winning, you generally want to be castled on the same side, and when you're losing, you generally want to be castled on the opposite side. So you just want the game to be a lot more dynamic when you're losing. Okay, pawn moves in front of your king. If you read Chernev's Logical Chess Move by Move, he's very big about not moving pawns in front of your king, but he's too big on that. In fact, some of my students who have got modern engines and apply them to the games in Chernev's Logical Chess Move by Move book said, hey, he criticized this move really heavily, and the engine said it's one of the better moves on the board. So you have to be a little bit careful. So sometimes moving pawns in front of your king is perfectly good to, like, give you space or give your king luft or whatever it is you're doing. But when you're castled on opposite sides, a lot of times moving up a pawn can create what we call a hook, where your opponent can play a break move against that pawn, and either you have to open up one line or the other to allow the opponent's rooks and queens to access to your king. So moving pawns on when you're castled opposite sides is more judicious. Now, what would be an example where you would want to move your pawns on when you're castled opposite sides? It would be to lock the pawns in front of your king, because your opponent's trying to use his pawns to blast open the lines, and if you can go past them and lock the pawns so that they can't easily open up the king, then it makes a lot of sense to move the pawns in front of your king in that state. All right, the fourth state we're going to look at is middle games with a closed fixed center, or at least maybe a very stable center, such as possibly like a stonewall opening. So we're talking maybe like an advanced French where you play e5 against the French on the third move, or a King's Indian where you play d5 after your opponent plays e5, to lock all four center pawns together. That's what I call a closed fixed center. So when you have the closed fixed center, that's when you can apply the pointing rule. The pointing rule doesn't make a lot of sense. If you don't understand the pointing rule, or if you think you do, you might want to check out my other video on the pointing rule. Because a lot of my students, when I first get them and I say, what's the pointing rule? They say things like, attack where your pawns are pointing. Well, that's way too general and doesn't really make a lot of sense in a lot of positions. So the way I like to say it is, if the D and E pawns are locked together against the opposing D and E pawns, so all four pawns can't move because they're up against each other, then you look at the way the pawns are pointing, and they are obviously in that case pointing to opposite directions, in which case they're pointing to the side where you want to make your break move, and they're pointing to the side where you want to expand and attack. If you use the pointing rule in any other way, like let's say the center has pawns on e3 and d4 versus e6 and d5, then both sides are pointing to the queen side, and that would be saying like white has an advantage on the queen side, attack there, and black has an advantage on the queen side, attack there. Well, they both can't have an advantage on the same side of the board. So it really doesn't make a lot of sense to apply the pointing rule other than the way I just said it. And if you apply it with locked pawns that are not the D and E pawns, it makes less and less sense as you move away from the center. If you apply it with A and B pawns, and your A and B pawn are locked up against their A and B pawns, your A and B pawns could be pointing right off the board to the left of the A file, and it said you should play off the board. So that wouldn't make any sense either. So if you do it with the D and E pawns, it always makes sense. If you do it with other pawns, or you do it if the pawns are not locked, it doesn't make as much sense. All right. The next principle we'll talk about is when you're playing with a locked center, you could kind of win one side of the board and lose the other side of the board, as we just said. And you want to attack, you want to follow Steinitz's rule where you want to attack where you have the advantage. And that's almost always on the side where you have the more pieces and your pawns are more effective. So you want to play in that side of the board more. If you find yourself defending on the opposite side where your opponent has more pieces, that's usually a sign that they have the initiative and that you have the lesser position. Okay, I also said in closed positions, tempos are less crucial. So the principle that, never waste any time, never move a piece backward, never move a piece twice, all those things. When the more the board is blocked off, the more files that are blocked, especially when the center is blocked, and even if the center is blocked, and even more than the center is blocked, then you can maneuver around a lot. A lot of times the opponent can't get in, you can't get out, and you have to figure out where your break moves are and how to get your pieces in position, and you could do a lot of maneuvering. Those are only really possible in closed positions. If you try those kind of things in positions where the board is completely open, things can get bad. For instance, I see people sometimes in the opening, they think they're going to retreat the knight and bring it around when their opponent has a chance to open up the center. And as soon as they start bringing their pieces backward, the opponent blasts open the center, and all of a sudden their pieces are stuck out of play. So you got to be very careful about doing those kind of things when the position is easily opened up. Okay, and the last point I have here on principles for block centers is opening files via break moves are crucial to provide mobility for rooks and even other pieces as well. The player who can get his rooks into the action first usually has a big advantage. That's a good general principle which can be applied in the opening as well as here in the locked positions. All right, one of my famous videos in Novice Nooks is how to play when you're way ahead. So I made that a complete state by itself. Positions where one player is winning easily. And I say in parentheses there in my article, a condition overriding all other states. For example, an opening where one player is winning easily needs to incorporate the guidelines below, possibly even in priority to normal opening guidelines. How much is winning easily? Well, a lot of my students say it depends on how good you are. If you're only up by the equivalent of 2 pawns and you're just a beginner, that's not very much. That's not winning easily for them. But if you're a grandmaster, the opponent might even resign in the same position. So, yeah, I mean, usually we think about at least being the equivalent of the exchange or 2 pawns ahead to be usually winning easily, and that assumes the opponent has no compensation. Obviously, if your opponent sacks a piece for an attack and you're up a knight, but your king is in danger or you can't get your pieces out or whatever, well, that's different. Then, we're not just talking about pure material advantage. We're really talking about how powerful your position is. So when you're winning easily, I say that there's 6 things that you want to do. And I get misquoted on this a lot. The first one is think defense first. I get misquoted on that so many times. People say, Dan Heisman says you should play defensively when you're winning easily. I never said that in my whole life. In fact, it doesn't make any sense. Defensively and think defense first just happens to have the same derivative. So even though defensively and defense have the same derivative word defense, they don't mean the same thing. And also the other words are important too. I say think defense first, not play defense first. Think defense first. And first is an ordering. It has nothing to do with what you actually should do. It has to do with how you think. So you want to think about your defensive ideas first. If you have 100 ideas of what you can do in a great position, and 3 of them are stopping what your opponent can do, and 97 are to attack them, think about the 3 first on stopping what they can do, and if they're all set, then work on the 97. You can play as offensively as you want. I never ever said play defensively. It's think defense first, not play defensively. There's such a big difference in those 2 things. One has to do with how you think, the order in which you think. The other has to do with how you play, which is not what I mean at all. Okay, the second thing is the famous keep it simple. When you're winning, you want the game to be very simple. You don't need complications. Complications favor the person who's losing. If I told you were up at night and you could create complications where one side or the other was sure to lose another piece, you wouldn't want to do it, because if you're the one who loses the piece, then you completely lose your advantage. Well, if they lose the piece, they were losing anyway, so they don't have that much to lose. So you'd rather keep it clear where you're just completely winning. So you want to keep it simple. The famous KISS principle applies here. That's number 2. The third thing is, everybody knows when you're way ahead, you want to trade pieces. Well, that's a little bit wrong. What you want to think is you want to make fair trades of pieces, not necessarily pawns. If you think fair trades of pieces, not necessarily pawns. So if you're only up a pawn and you could trade rooks, but then you give him the file and he controls the file and you can never get it back, that's not really necessarily a fair trade. But if you're up a queen and you could trade rooks and it gives him the file, who cares? Give him the file. It doesn't mean anything. So you want to make fair trades of pieces, not necessarily pawns. And I have a whole video on trading pawns when ahead. When do you want to trade pawns when you're ahead? When do you not want to trade pawns when you're ahead? That's a whole different ball game. All right, the fourth thing you want to do when you're way ahead is keep all your pieces active all the time, which is true in general anyway, but it's sort of like a hockey team on the power play. If you have an extra man on the ice, which means you have an extra knight on the board, then you want to make sure all your guys are doing something. If you have extra pieces on the board and you're not using them, then your opponent has chances to do a lot of things. The way you can overwhelm them is by making sure to use all your pieces all the time, so that's important. You don't want to get into unnecessary time pressure. I see a lot of people, they're playing like a 65 game, and after 14 minutes they win a piece, and then they sit there trying to be too exact for the next 40 minutes, and next thing you know, they have 5 minutes left, and there's still lots of pieces on the board, and then they start making crazy moves, and they throw the game away. So when you're winning easily, you want to avoid extreme time pressure if you can, because that's where you could really make big mistakes. So you don't have to be quite as perfect. You don't really have to look for the exact best move when you're that far ahead. If you're that far ahead, any really good move will do. And there might be a position where you have 8 reasonable moves that will win the game easily. You don't have to try to nitpick which one is the best one. So we've got think defense first, trade pieces, not necessarily pawns, keep it simple, avoid unnecessary time trouble, use all your pieces all the time, and I think there might even be, let's see, one more. Let's see, winning. That's probably good enough for now. What do I have here in my little article? I say you don't get extra points for winning quickly. In fact, some positions are winning on move 20 could easily be where your opponent would take 40 moves to resign. So you have to be patient when you're winning. All right, well, that makes sense too. The final note I have is a lot of the other principles that you know so well in other states are often relatively worthless. And I say, for example, if you're up a piece and can trade queens, it doesn't matter so much if the trade isolates or doubles your pawns or even prevents you from castling. These otherwise important issues are relatively meaningless if you're way ahead in material. Okay, so for instance, if you're up a knight and you could trade queens, but it doubles your pawns and you lose, doubling your pawns could lose you 0.07 pawns or something. Well, not too many games are lost on 0.07 pawns, but if you're up 3.5 points of value, pawns of value with a knight or an extra bishop, then doubling your pawns basically means almost nothing, but getting the queens off the board is really important. So the queen trade is way, way more important than any minor change in your pawn structure. All right, the last principle I threw in, the last state I threw in is everything else, especially middle games with relatively open centers. And I say this is the plurality of positions, the one that occur the most often. Most of the guidelines you know and read about are usually best applied to these wide-ranging positions, so my special notes below are few. So what I'm saying here is, if you've learned a million principles to apply in a chess game, this particular state where, the material is relatively even, the center is not locked, it's more like either open or semi-open, nothing special was happening, you're not on castle on opposite sides, then most of the principles you've learned about, the piece values, the what you should do, and so on, are pretty much the same that you would use here. So they pretty much apply pretty easily. So let me read my conclusion here. Recognizing these states and understanding the underlying principles and guidelines can help put you on the correct path toward better planning and candidate move selection. After all, it was world champion Alexander Alyakin who said something like, "The idea is not to find the correct move, but to find the correct plan and then the move which best implements it." I agree with modern theorists who think this emphasis on general planning may be a little too strong, maybe not pragmatic enough, but it remains the legitimate concept. And so if you were using your general strategy, and strategy never replaces your analysis, you could use all these principles you want, but if you only use principles, I call that hand waving. And hand waving is okay. Let's say it's the first move of the game and your opponent plays A3, and you don't know what to do. You don't have a book move against A3. Then you can hand wave all you want and use general ideas to come up with your move. But if you're in a position where the two sides are in conflict and there are safety issues involved with checks, captures, and threats, then these principles that we talked about in today's video have to take second billing to your actual analysis of what moves are safe, whether or not you have a tactic or you're giving your opponent a tactic, and the actual evaluation of which position gives you the best position. But these principles can help you a lot, and understanding what state you're in will help you decide which principle. Okay, hope you enjoyed today's video. Please tell your friends about my channel, Dan Heisman Chess. I have over 370 videos covering pretty much every aspect of chess improvement. A couple of them have won awards from the Chess Journalists of America. If you like the video, great. If you want to subscribe to the channel, I appreciate it. And we'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye.